Thank you very much. Good morning. The legal reason for this presentation is that you've already heard that it's the anniversary of the ratification of the Constitution. In 2004, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia sponsored a federal law that requires all schools receiving federal funding, which is every public school, K-12, college, and university in the United States, to do a commemoration of the Constitution on or about September 17th of every year. So this is how Winthrop is fulfilling a legal requirement that makes it possible for you to get your Pell Grants and faculty to get research grants and so forth. So I was asked to do a presentation, and I decided on the Constitution and gerrymandering. And the Constitution doesn't actually tell states how to draw their district lines. But, you know, I could come here and say the Constitution, even though the presentation is called the Constitution, Redistricting, and Gerrymandering, there's nothing in the Constitution about redistricting and gerrymandering. But I figured that probably wouldn't fulfill the legal requirement that we actually talk about the Constitution. So let's look at how it works. So you have a group of people chosen to represent a given area in a legislative body. South Carolina selects a certain number of people to serve in the United States House of Representatives. York County elects a certain number of people to serve on the county council. The city of Rock Hill chooses a certain number of people to serve on the city council. And one way to elect those people is to divide the area into districts or wards. And each district would then elect one or more representatives. So, for example, South Carolina is divided into 7 congressional districts, and each one of those districts elects one member of the United States House of Representatives. So there we are up at the very top of the 5th district. The reason we take the census every 10 years is to determine how many seats each state gets in the U.S. House of Representatives, but the states also use that data for determining the population apportionment in their state legislatures. So we know, for example, that South Carolina gets 7 seats in the U.S. House, but then we have to figure out how to divide the state into 7 districts in order to choose those 7 people. There's a legal requirement that in Congress, each district within a state has to consist of as close to equal population as possible. So the state of South Carolina is divided into 7 districts. The population of the state is not evenly divisible by 7. There's a remainder of 3. So 3 of our districts each have 1 more person than the other 4. That's almost exact population equality. State legislatures don't have to be that exactly close in population. They have to be within 5% above or below. Each district has to be within the average population. So you draw districts, and they have to be either equal or roughly equal in population. But beyond that, how do you decide how the districts get drawn? And who makes the decision? In most states, it's the state legislature. So the South Carolina General Assembly, the year after the census is conducted, they look at the data, they divide the state into 7 districts, for Congress, they divide the state into 46 districts for the state Senate, they divide the state into 124 districts for the state House, and so forth. How you draw the lines determines who gets elected. So if you have a situation, as in South Carolina, where the Republican Party controls the legislature, in California, the Democratic Party controls the legislature, the majority party is going to draw the lines to maximize the number of seats that they win, to maximize their partisan advantage. So gerrymandering is drawing the lines with the intention of benefiting one particular party, one particular group, one particular area, or one particular individual. So you can draw the lines to maximize the number of Republicans or the number of Democrats. You can draw the lines to maximize the opportunity for a member of a particular group to get elected, although racial gerrymandering has been ruled unconstitutional. You can draw the lines to maximize the possibility that somebody from a particular area will be represented. So there's the 4th Congressional District to our west consists of primarily Greenville and Spartanburg. There's kind of a rivalry between Greenville and Spartanburg, so if the people from Spartanburg wanted to maximize the opportunity to have their own representative as opposed to somebody from Greenville, then they might draw the lines to put more of the population of the district in Spartanburg County. And you can draw the lines to benefit an individual who has a particular political base or area of strength in a particular area. So there are a variety of reasons why you might want to gerrymander. Usually the result of gerrymandering is that the majority party gets more seats than their proportion of the votes or their proportion of the population. So not just a majority, but a large majority of seats. And sometimes if the lines are particularly craftily drawn, you can actually get a group of representatives who don't represent majority public opinion. And I'm going to cover both of those momentarily. So why is it called gerrymandering? This is Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts in the early 19th century and then briefly vice president until he died in office. He pronounced his name Gerry with a hard G, but for reasons unclear, the political practice named for him has come to be called gerrymandering, pronounced with a soft G. So when Gerry was governor, the Massachusetts legislature drew a districting plan that heavily benefited his party. And one of the districts, a newspaper cartoonist looked at the map and decided that one of the districts looked like a salamander. So he drew a political cartoon in the paper, called it a gerrymander, and the name stuck. And this is the original gerrymander from 1812. You see this district, this is northeastern Massachusetts, I believe, and it kind of snakes around, and the guy put a head and fangs and wings and feet on it, and that's a little more malevolent than I remember salamanders being, but anyway, this is where the term comes from. So how do you do it? Okay. 50 people, 30 blue voters, 20 red voters, and you've got to divide them into 5 districts. There are several different ways you can do that. Number one, you draw the line so that you get 60% blue representation, 40% red representation. So that plan is perfectly representative of the population. Plan 2, which is what Massachusetts seems to have done in the U.S. House, you draw every district with a majority of blue voters, so that even though the red people are 40% of the population, they get no representation at all. Then number 3. And if you look at this sort of jigsaw puzzle, you have 3 districts that have 6 red people, 4 blue people. You have 2 districts that have 9 blue people and 1 red person. And so even though the red voters are a minority of the population, they end up with 3 red districts as opposed to 2. And how you do that is you cram or pack the blue voters into a smaller number of districts where they have a supermajority. So the 2 blue districts are overwhelmingly blue, the 3 red districts are just majority red, and that's how you end up with a delegation of people who don't represent the overall popular vote. And let's call that North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So usually when you draw districts, you want compactness, contiguity, and keeping communities of interest together. Compactness is just a geographic measure of the physical area covered by a district. A piece of spaghetti is not compact, but a baseball or some solid object is compact, but you can draw a congressional district that looks like a piece of spaghetti. We're going to look at some. Contiguity. All parts of a district must be physically connected and not separate. So you can't have part of District 1 over here, then District 2 in the middle, and then part of District 1 over here. You've got to connect them somehow. Now, there are places in the United States that are only connected by water. For example, Hawaii has 2 congressional districts. One district is downtown Honolulu, and the other district is the whole rest of the state. So obviously the islands, the other Hawaiian islands, are not connected except by water, but that's okay. It's still a contiguous district. Communities of interest. You're supposed to keep places such as cities or counties within the same district. You're not supposed to split them if it's avoidable. Some states have state constitutional requirements that say you can't split counties, but that's been superseded by legal findings that districts have to be of equal population. So let's take a look at how South Carolina's congressional districts have evolved in the last 50 years or so. So this is the districting plan that we used in the 1970s. Nice regular lines. You can look at the map and figure out which district you're in. Whole counties, they didn't split up any counties, so Greenville and Spartanburg together were the entire 4th congressional district. But these were not exactly equal in population. There was a variance of a few thousand people between districts. 1980s, this was when the court started enforcing the equal population requirements down to 1 person per district. So for the first time in the 1980s, if you see Berkeley County down by Charleston, they split that. That was a violation of the state constitutional requirement that said counties can't be split between districts. And so this went to court, and the courts ruled that it was more compelling to have exactly equal population among the districts than it was to keep the counties together. The 1990s is when the district lines start getting really interesting looking. Art majors, cover your eyes. And what's going on here is that in the 1990s there was a legal requirement to maximize the opportunity for the election of people from groups that had traditionally been disenfranchised, which in South Carolina means African Americans. So the state was required to draw a district that would facilitate the election of an African American member of Congress. So what happened is they drew together the African American areas of Charleston, the African American areas of Columbia, Sumter, and so forth, grouped those together in a district with an African American majority population, and this is the district that originally elected Congressman James Clyburn in 1992. So things get smoothed out a little in the 2000s because there was a Supreme Court decision that says you can't use race as the predominant consideration in constructing a district. So you're no longer able to go look at the population data of the state of South Carolina and say we're going to group all the African Americans together to elect an African American representative. But what you can do is look at partisan data. So this was a map designed to elect an African American out of the 6 districts by grouping African American voters together. This, let's put all the Democrats in South Carolina in one district, creating an overwhelmingly Democratic district. And let's put the Republicans in Charleston in the 1st district and the Republicans in Columbia in the 2nd district, and let's group all the Democrats together in one district. Wow, what a coincidence. 59% of the people in the 6th district are African American. Who saw that coming? So you can't district on the basis of race, but you can district on the basis of party. And this is what we have now in 2010. And you see that Richland County and Charleston County are still divided largely among partisan lines for most of the decade because most of the Democrats in South Carolina are in the 6th district. We had, of these 7 districts, 6 of them elected Republicans, and the 6th district elected Mr. Clyburn, who is still there. And then last year, Joe Cunningham won in the 1st district, so we now have 5 Republican representatives and 2 Democrats. So that's what it looks like in South Carolina. These are examples of some of the most creatively or egregiously gerrymandered districts in the country. So, for example, the top left is North Carolina 12th, and to orient you geographically, the bottom left is Charlotte, the top right is Greensboro. The 5th District of Florida, that's outside Jacksonville. The 7th District of Pennsylvania, that's the Philadelphia and suburbs. And a commentator, if you look at the one on the top right, a commentator described this as goofy kicking Donald Duck. So take a second and see if you see that. I think they use these for psychological testing. Then you have the Maryland 3rd District, that is wandering in and out of Baltimore. The North Carolina 1st District, which is the northeastern part of the state, and then someplace in Texas I'm not familiar with. Now, the North Carolina and Pennsylvania districts were overturned and redrawn as a result of some of the court cases I'm going to talk about. So what's the effect of this? Now, 2010 was a heavily Republican year at the polls. That's also the year the census was conducted. So the Republican Party took control or kept control of state legislatures in a majority of the states, so they get to draw the lines for the next decade. So in the Democratic states, the Democratic legislatures are drawing the lines to maximize the number of Democrats, and in a larger number of states, the Republican legislatures are drawing the lines to maximize the number of Republicans. And here's what you end up with in terms of how the vote in each state translates into the number of representatives. So, as I told you, in most cases, the majority party is going to increase or expand its number of seats beyond what their share of the vote would entitle them to. So, California, 59% of the voters statewide voted for Democratic members of the U.S. House, but the Democrats won 72% of the seats. Illinois, Democrats got 54% of the vote, 67% of the seats. Maryland, almost 63% of the vote, but 7 out of 8 of the congressional seats. The Republican voters in Massachusetts might as well not have showed up, because 30% of the vote got them no representation in the House of Representatives. New York is like that. So you have Democratic legislatures maximizing Democratic voting advantage. Now let's look at some of the other ones. Florida. The Republicans got just over 51% of the vote and got almost 2/3 of the seats. Georgia, 50.24 to 49.76, and yet 9 Republican seats, only 5 Democrats. Michigan, even closer, and the split was 10-3. Ohio, 51 to 46, and the Republicans got 3/4 of the seats. We think of South Carolina as a hugely Republican state, but in fact, the Democratic Party routinely gets 44 to 46% of the vote in statewide elections. So in South Carolina in 2012, 46% of the voters voted Democratic for the U.S. House, and yet, because of the way the lines were drawn from the map I just showed you, only 1 out of 6 seats. Now let's look at North Carolina and Pennsylvania, where a majority of the voters who went to the polls statewide voted for Democratic representatives, and yet in North Carolina, the Democrats only got 4 seats, the Republicans won 9. In Pennsylvania, it was 5 to 13. So how does that happen? How do you draw the lines so that a majority of the voters don't turn into a majority of the seats? So let's look at the election returns from North Carolina. This is district by district. They have 13 districts. So you can see the Democrats won the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 12th districts, and the Republicans won the other 9. And the 7th district was very, very close. But the other three Democratic wins were blowouts. 75% in the 1st District, 74% in the 4th District, 79% in the 12th District, and those were more impressive victories than any of the seats the Republicans won. And here's how that came about. The Republican Party got control of the legislature in 2010. They controlled the districting process. The governor of North Carolina can't veto districting bills, so it's entirely up to the legislature. And what happened was they concentrated the Democratic vote, packed the Democratic voters into the 1st, 4th, and 12th districts. The 1st district is the one I showed you a second ago in northeastern North Carolina, which is a heavily African-American area, heavily Democratic area. The 4th district is Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. State government employees, African-Americans, and university people, i.e. Democrats. The 12th district links the Democratic areas of Charlotte and the Democratic areas of Greensboro in an overwhelmingly Democratic district. So if you cram all of the Democrats or most of the Democratic voters in the state into those three districts, the Democrats are going to overwhelmingly win those three, but the Republican vote is much more efficiently distributed. You don't need 75% of the vote to win. So the congressman in the 2nd district congresswoman, got elected with 55. The congresswoman in the 5th district got elected with 57. 8th district 53, and so forth. So the Republican districting plan sort of maximized Republican strength by distributing Republican voters into as many seats as possible where they'd get the majority. And this is a quote from the Republican state representative who chaired the committee. I propose that we draw the maps to give a partisan advantage to 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, because I do not believe it's possible to draw a map with 11 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So they were absolutely clear about their interest in maintaining or maximizing their partisan advantage. And I am not, Tyler, picking on the Republican Party, because the Democrats do it too. The Democrats did it in California, the Democrats did it in Illinois, the Democrats did it in Maryland and really in Massachusetts, and they did it in New York. Both sides do it. So this was challenged in court. Somebody said, I'm being discriminated against because I'm not being adequately represented. The Supreme Court ruled that the case was non-justiciable, meaning this is not a matter of federal court jurisdiction. But before the Supreme Court heard that appeal, a lower court ordered the state to redraw their lines for the 2016 election. So they redraw their lines, they conduct 13 U.S. House elections under different boundaries, and they still elected 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So how is gerrymandering legal? It sounds like somebody's being discriminated against at every step of the process. Democrats are being discriminated against in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Republicans are being discriminated against in California, Maryland, Illinois, New York, etc. So the federal courts have traditionally not dealt with what they call political questions. If the Constitution gives jurisdiction to another branch of government, the federal courts aren't going to touch it. So the Constitution gives Congress jurisdiction over federal elections, that is, the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate. Congress and the states share responsibility for presidential elections. State legislatures have jurisdiction over state and local elections. So the federal court ordinarily is not going to have jurisdiction to tell North Carolina how to draw its state legislative boundaries or its congressional districts. When do the federal courts get involved? If somebody's rights under the U.S. Constitution are being violated, that is a matter of federal court jurisdiction. So the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause struck down malapportionment when you had districts of wildly different populations that had the same number of representatives. That discriminates against people in larger areas. That's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That's unconstitutional. Race-based districting is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So drawing a district to elect an African American is, in the court's view, a violation of the rights of the white voters in that district. The 15th Amendment doesn't prohibit voting discrimination against black people. It prohibits voting discrimination on the basis of race. You can't discriminate against white voters either. So if there are violations of the 15th Amendment, race discrimination, sex discrimination, a poll tax requirement, or age discrimination if you're at least 18, then that's a federal court issue. That's when the federal courts are going to get involved. You do not have the right to be, there is no protection against discrimination on the basis of political party. You can't discriminate against African Americans. You can't discriminate against women. You are perfectly free to discriminate against Democrats or Republicans. And there's no right to proportional representation. So back to the North Carolina example. Okay, we held this election and more people voted Democratic, but Republicans got 9 of the 13 seats. That doesn't matter because you're not electing a group. Each of those districts is electing an individual. And just because 9 of those districts chose to elect Republicans and only 4 in that election chose to elect Democrats, that doesn't mean there's a constitutional violation because there were more Democratic votes cast statewide. So the federal courts have generally not struck down political gerrymandering. And here was the definitive answer on this. Is politically motivated partisan gerrymandering justiciable, subject to federal court jurisdiction? So this was a Supreme Court decision in 2004. The Republicans in Pennsylvania gerrymandered the state legislature to their advantage. A Democratic voter sued. It goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has to first decide whether they have jurisdiction because they don't normally get involved in political questions. So here's how they decided it. Is this justiciable? Justices Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer said yes. Justices Rehnquist, O'Connor, Scalia, and Thomas said no. Justice Kennedy, being even more of a swing vote than usual, said maybe. So the plurality opinion was maybe. It depends on the circumstances. So they didn't set any kind of legal standard. What they do is they consider gerrymandering cases on an individual case-by-case basis. year, case out of North Carolina, yet another election case out of North Carolina. There was a case brought against North Carolina's congressional districts, and the court said it's a political question, we're not going to touch it. So the federal courts don't often assert their jurisdiction here, but state courts do. So last year, there was a challenge to the Pennsylvania districting plan that produced 13 Republicans, 5 Democrats in a state that voted majority Democratic. A group of people chosen by the state Republican Party and maybe some political independents, and they get together